So one of the final topics we're going to talk about here are what are called biogeochemical cycles. We already established that energy flows through an ecosystem and is eventually dissipated as heat, but the chemical elements that make up life are recycled over and over again. The ways in which these elements, and sometimes compounds like water, move and are recycled between living things in the environment, those are called biogeochemical cycles. In this class, we're going to talk about 4 of those. We're going to talk about the carbon cycle, the nitrogen cycle, the phosphorus cycle, and the water cycle. Those are all very important to life. So we'll start with the carbon cycle. And I'm just going to talk about the carbon cycle from a diagram. So the carbon cycle is mostly about photosynthesis and cell respiration. So there's lots of carbon, inorganic carbon, in the air as carbon dioxide. That CO2 is taken in by our plants and our algae and our cyanobacteria. It's incorporated into the biomolecules of those plants, becomes organic carbon. That organic carbon is eaten, in this case by cows, but any kind of primary consumer, or by a decomposer. Those organisms, somewhere along the food chain, do aerobic cell respiration on those sugars, and one of the waste products of aerobic respiration is CO2, which is released back into the environment. So photosynthesis is taking in the CO2, incorporating into organic molecules. Cell respiration is breaking down the organic molecules, releasing the CO2 back into the environment. And that can happen at any level of the food chain, even the decomposers. Some other things that can happen with CO2, humans have had several impacts on the carbon cycle. One of those is the burning of fossil fuels. Fossil fuels are carbon-based molecules. When we burn them, we give off CO2. And we know that by burning gas and oil, we've increased the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. There's some theories that CO2 acts as what we call a greenhouse gas and helps to trap heat in the environment and has contributed to global warming. The oceans and other bodies of water can take in CO2 and store it. Some organic matter can be pushed down into the earth and eventually under pressure and heat form fossil fuels. So all of those things are part of the carbon cycle. Let's also talk about the nitrogen cycle. Nitrogen is very abundant on Earth, but most of Earth's nitrogen is found in the form of N2 gas. Over 70% of the atmosphere is made of nitrogen gas, but the two nitrogen atoms in an N2 molecule are held together by very strong triple covalent bonds. Most plants and animals can't metabolize it or use those nitrogen atoms. So there's 4 major processes that help to cycle nitrogen through the environment. They're nitrogen fixation, decomposition or ammonification, nitrification, and denitrification. So nitrogen fixation is a term that describes processes that convert the atmospheric N2, into forms of nitrogen containing molecules that can be metabolized. One of those is atmospheric nitrogen fixation. So in this process, lightning essentially strikes nitrogen molecules that are in the atmosphere, allows those nitrogen atoms to combine with oxygen to make nitrogen oxides, which dissolve in the rain and form nitrates that are carried down to the earth and ultimately into the soil. A second process is called biological nitrogen fixation. This is when bacteria or archaea, which either are free living in the soil or in the water, or maybe some of them live in mutualistic symbiotic relationships with plant roots, like legumes, like soybeans and such. These take into and convert that into ammonia, NH3. This ammonia, most of it is quickly absorbed by the plants and is used by the plants to create things like proteins and other organic nitrogen-containing molecules, like DNA, for example. There's also a third process called industrial nitrogen fixation. Scientists figured out that under high pressure and high temperature, chemists could synthesize ammonia from atmospheric nitrogen. And this is the basis for the creation of nitrogen-containing fertilizers, whether they use ammonia directly or converted into ammonium nitrate. So this is the way scientists create artificial nitrogen-based fertilizers. So then we've got decomposition or ammonification. So the nitrogen-containing proteins in the DNA and RNA made by plants, algae, and cyanobacteria pass through food chains, food webs, just like sugars do. At every trophic level, some of these molecules are metabolized. They produce nitrogen-containing molecules that return to the environment in either excretions or in the dead bodies. Microorganisms break down these organic nitrogen-containing molecules and convert them back into ammonia, NH3. That's why it's called ammonification. The ammonia produced from the decay, some of it's taken directly by plant roots. A lot of it, though, is converted by bacteria or archaea into nitrates, which would be like an NO2 minus 1, or nitrates, NO3 minus 1, via this process called nitrification. Finally, denitrification reduces. Here we don't mean like lowers the amount. Here we mean adds electrons to nitrates and nitrites in the soil and ultimately converts those back into nitrogen gas, which goes back up into the air and starts the process over again. So here we can see the nitrogen cycle. So nitrogen fixing bacteria, either living on plant roots or the soil, carry out nitrogen fixation. Convert that into typically ammonia. That ammonia is absorbed by plants, used to make nitrogen-containing organic molecules. Those are eaten by consumers or ultimately decomposers. And we get ammonification, where those nitrogen-containing biomolecules are converted back to ammonia or ammonium ion. That ammonia or ammonium ion is then nitrified. It goes through nitrification, where it's converted into nitrates or nitrites and nitrates, and then it gets denitrified by bacteria and turned back into nitrogen gas. Now, humans have also had an impact on the nitrogen cycle. We've learned how to create artificial fertilizers. We also release a lot of sewage and other nitrogen-containing waste into bodies of water. Typically, the levels of nitrogen, usable nitrogen in the water is low. And oftentimes, nitrogen is a limiting factor for plant growth and algae growth. Eutrophication occurs when a body of water receives an excessive nutrient load. Usually it's nitrogen, can also be phosphorus. So that nitrogen was a limiting factor, but now it's not anymore. So the algae in that body of water grow like crazy. Ultimately, they start to die, have a very short lifespan. They start to decompose under the water. Well, decomposition, a large part of it is aerobic cellular respiration. So that uses up the oxygen that's in the water. So the dissolved oxygen levels in the water drop. This ends up causing a die-off of all kinds of underwater aquatic plants, fish. Most of the life of the plant, of the lake or pond dies because too much nitrogen was in the water. And ultimately it caused the dissolved oxygen levels to drop down near zero. So that's called eutrophication. Let's also talk a minute about the phosphorus cycle. Phosphorus is also an essential nutrient for animals and plants. It's important in cell development. It's an important part of biomolecules like ATP, DNA, and the phospholipids that make up our cell membranes. Not enough phosphorus in the soil also can slow plant growth. Phosphorus is found on Earth in a lot of different compounds, like phosphate ion, which is PO4 minus 3. But generally, the amount of phosphorus in the soil is pretty small, and this often limits plant growth. This is why people oftentimes apply phosphate-based fertilizers to farmland. It helps the plants grow faster. Animals typically get their phosphates by eating plants or plant-eating animals. Turns out most of Earth's phosphorus is stored in rocks as inorganic phosphate. Over time, things like rain and weathering cause the rocks to release phosphates. They get distributed in the soil and the groundwater, and that inorganic phosphate is taken up by plants, and then the plants use it to make their own organic biomolecules, like phospholipids and DNA. Animals get the phosphorus they need by eating these plants or other animals that ate the plants. Once a plant or animal dies and decays, the organic phosphate is returned to the soil, and in the soil, bacteria break down that organic matter and convert the organic phosphate back into inorganic phosphate. That process is called mineralization. Some of this phosphate can end up in the sediments and can be pushed down and ultimately turned back into rock form, where the cycle starts over again. So here we see the phosphorus cycle. Again, most of Earth's phosphorus is contained in rocks as phosphate. We get weathering and erosion, which release it. It gets taken up by plants or algae, which use it to make their phosphorus-containing organic molecules. Animals get the phosphorus they need by eating the plants or other animals that ate the plants. Like with the nitrogen cycle, humans have had an impact on the phosphorus cycle. A lot of detergents, for example, used to contain high amounts of phosphorus. Sewage contains phosphorus. When those have been released into bodies of water, because the phosphorus acted as a limiting reactant on algal growth, once extra phosphate was put into the water, again, we ended up with eutrophication, this crazy algal bloom. And ultimately, after the algal bloom, as the algae die and are decomposed by cell respiration, it causes dissolved oxygen levels in the water to drop to critical levels, causing a die-off of lots of the plant and animal life in the water. So that's usually caused by human interaction with the environment, human waste products being released into some kind of body of water. The last cycle, biogeochemical cycle mentioned, is the water cycle. This is one you guys have studied since first grade, probably. Water cycle is also called the hydrologic cycle. So we know that water evaporates from bodies of water like lakes, swamps, rivers, and oceans, makes water vapor. The water vapor rises, cools off, condenses back into tiny droplets of water. That makes clouds. The clouds then drop that water as either rain or snow. Call that precipitation. And then the precipitation is absorbed either into the ground or it runs off into rivers and streams or oceans. The water that's absorbed into the ground is ultimately taken up by plants, and plants move that water up through their stems and out their leaves through a process called transpiration, ultimately releasing water vapor back into the air. Water that runs off into the rivers flows into ponds, lakes, oceans, it evaporates, starts the cycle back over again. So just like with all the other biogeochemical cycles we've mentioned today, humans have impacted the water cycle. We've extracted a lot of groundwater for use in homes or use in agriculture, like watering crops. In commercial uses, that's lowered the amount of water underground, the water table. Cities and urbanization have led to more runoff and more contamination of our rivers and our streams and even our underground water sources. By burning fossil fuels, combustion releases water vapor into the air, and we've increased the amount of water vapor in the air due to combustion. And then we've also created these large water reservoirs by damming. And this has caused the drying up of many small streams. Because we're storing more of the water on land, it can cause a decrease in sea levels. And it can also block the migration of different kinds of animals like fish. So here we see our water cycle. Evaporation. Ultimately, we get condensation, forming clouds. Precipitation. We get groundwater, runoff. Notice we've got transpiration. All of the parts that we talked about in our previous points are on this diagram. It's a really good depiction of the water cycle. So let's